Welcome to English Easy Hub. Join us as we ignite the flames of your English learning journey together.
Please subscribe to watch and embark on your English learning journey. Don't miss out on the exciting content. In this conversation, Simon seeks advice on how to shift from translating his thoughts into English to thinking directly in the language. His teacher provides practical strategies for overcoming this habit, focusing on immersion, vocabulary expansion, and more natural speaking and writing practices. Through insightful questions and guidance, Simon explores ways to build fluency, understand context better, and become more confident in using English.
Hi, teacher. I've been thinking a lot about my English learning lately. One thing that has always confused me is how to start thinking directly in English instead of always translating from my native language. Do you have any tips or techniques for doing this?
That's an excellent question, Simon. The habit of translating word for word is quite common, especially in the early stages of language learning. But to really start thinking in English, you need to immerse yourself in the language as much as possible. Surround yourself with English, whether that's through movies, podcasts, books, or even conversations with native speakers. Over time, your brain begins to switch from translation to direct understanding. Have you been doing this already?
Yes, I listen to podcasts and watch English shows, but when I hear new words, I immediately translate them back into my native language to understand. It feels like a reflex. How can I stop that habit and understand directly in English without translating?
Good question. One strategy is to focus more on the context of the words rather than the words themselves. For instance, when you encounter a new word, rather than translating it, pay attention to the sentence or situation around it. What is the overall meaning or feeling being conveyed? In English, a lot of meaning is derived from the context. Over time, your brain will start to build a sense of what words mean in their context. This is actually a natural process of language acquisition. Have you ever noticed that you understand certain phrases or words just by hearing them in specific situations, even without translating them?
Yeah, sometimes when I hear common expressions like "how's it going?" or "I'm feeling under the weather," I understand immediately without thinking. But when I encounter unfamiliar words, I can't help but translate. How can I build this sense for new words?
That's a great observation. For unfamiliar words, one technique is to try guessing their meaning based on the context. Let's say you hear a word like scattered in a sentence. Instead of immediately translating, think, what's happening around this word? Maybe it's describing something that's spread out or disorganized. Often, the meaning will start to emerge. Also, it helps to read more in English because the repetition of words in different contexts will gradually make you more comfortable with them. Do you read English texts regularly?
I do read sometimes, but I often find myself stopping to look up words. Maybe that interrupts the flow of understanding. Should I avoid stopping to look up words while reading?
It's a tough balance. But yes, sometimes it's better to continue reading without stopping to look up every word. If you can infer the meaning from context, just keep reading. This helps train your brain to get used to seeing new words without the need for a dictionary every time. However, if you find that you've come across a word you really don't understand, then look it up. The key is not to interrupt the flow too much. I also recommend reviewing new words at the end of your reading session and making a note of them. That way, you're still building your vocabulary, but you're also learning to understand the text as a whole.
That makes sense. I guess if I keep reading and don't stop to translate, I'll eventually learn to understand more naturally. But what about speaking? When I'm talking, I often struggle to find the right words. How can I speak more fluidly without pausing too much to think?
Speaking is another challenge that many learners face. One thing that can help is to practice thinking in English throughout the day. For example, when you're doing daily activities like cooking or walking, try to describe what you're doing in English. If you're cooking, you might think, I'm chopping the onions, adding the garlic, and heating the pan. This constant practice of speaking to yourself in English helps your brain start forming sentences in real time without needing to translate. Do you ever try to speak to yourself in English during your day?
I haven't really done that before, but it sounds like a good idea. I'll try to describe my actions and thoughts more in English. But what if I get stuck while speaking? I often feel like I'm forgetting words or grammar rules, and that makes me nervous.
It's completely normal to feel nervous, but you need to embrace the idea that mistakes are part of the learning process. Everyone makes mistakes, even native speakers. One thing you can try is to reframe how you think about mistakes. Instead of seeing them as failures, view them as opportunities to improve. When you're speaking, try to focus less on being perfect and more on getting your message across. Even if you make mistakes, most people will understand you if you communicate clearly. Have you thought about setting a small speaking goal, like talking for 3 to 5 minutes without worrying too much about grammar?
I like the idea of setting small goals. If I can talk for a few minutes without worrying about making mistakes, that sounds more achievable. I'll focus more on communication than on perfection. But when I'm speaking, I often feel like I'm not using enough variety in my vocabulary. How can I expand my word choice and sound more natural?
That's an excellent point. Expanding your vocabulary is key to speaking more naturally. A good approach is to actively learn synonyms for words you use often. For example, instead of always saying happy, you could also use joyful, content, delighted, or cheerful. Another technique is to keep a vocabulary journal where you write down new words you learn and try to use them in sentences. This helps you remember them better. Also, try to expose yourself to different accents and dialects in English, as this will give you a broader range of expressions and phrases. Do you already keep a journal of new words?
I've tried keeping a vocabulary list, but I don't always make the effort to use the words in sentences. Maybe that's why I forget them so quickly. I'll try to use them more actively. And I think I'll also start listening to different accents to get a better sense of varied expressions. What about writing? I often find it hard to express my ideas in English the way I want to. How can I make my writing sound more natural?
Writing is another area where thinking in English can make a big difference. One tip is to imitate good writing. If you read something that resonates with you, try rewriting it in your own words, paying attention to sentence structure, word choice, and style. You don't need to copy the exact words, but by doing this, you'll internalize the flow of natural writing. Also, when you write, don't worry too much about the first draft. Just let your thoughts flow onto the page, and you can refine them later. A lot of writing comes from practicing without judgment. Do you often write in English like journaling or blogging?
I haven't done much journaling in English, but I can see how it would help. If I just focus on getting my thoughts down first and revise later, that would take some pressure off. I'll give that a try. So, the idea is to keep practicing without worrying too much about getting everything perfect?
Exactly. And remember, consistency is key. If you can incorporate English into your daily life, whether it's through listening, speaking, reading, or writing, your brain will start making the switch from translation to thinking directly in English. Don't rush the process. Over time, it will become more natural, and you'll notice that you're using English more intuitively. How do you feel about applying these tips in your daily routine?
I feel much more confident now. I think the key is to embrace mistakes and focus on understanding through context, not translation. I'll try describing my day in English, using new vocabulary, and writing more freely. Thanks so much for all the great advice. I feel like I have a clearer path forward now.
You're very welcome, Simon. I'm glad to see you so motivated. Remember, language learning is a marathon, not a sprint. Don't worry if things feel slow at times. Just keep going, and you'll see progress. The most important thing is to stay consistent, stay curious, and most importantly, enjoy the process. You've got this.
Thank you, teacher. I feel like I've got a much clearer approach now. But I'm curious sometimes, when I'm listening to native speakers, they use expressions or slang that I don't fully understand. How do I start using these expressions naturally in my own speech?
Great question, Simon. Slang and expressions can definitely be tricky, but the key is exposure and practice. Start by paying attention to how native speakers use these phrases in context. Don't worry too much about using them perfectly at first. Instead, focus on understanding the situation and the tone in which they're used. For example, if you hear someone say, "That's a game changer," listen to how they use it. It usually means something that has a big positive impact. Once you understand the meaning and context, you can start using it in similar situations. The more you hear and use these expressions, the more natural it will feel. Have you heard any phrases or slang that you're unsure about recently?
Yeah, I've heard people use "I'm over the moon" or "let's call it a day." At first, I didn't get what they meant, but I started hearing them more often. I guess I'm getting better at picking up the meanings based on context, but I still feel a bit unsure about using them. How can I get more comfortable with them?
Good examples. Both "I'm over the moon" and "let's call it a day" are quite common in casual conversation. "I'm over the moon" means you're extremely happy or excited, and "let's call it a day" means you've finished something for the day. A great way to practice using them is by repeating them in your own conversations, even if it feels a bit forced at first. You can also make flashcards with these expressions and write example sentences using them. The more you actively practice, the more comfortable you'll get. What about writing? Do you feel confident in writing these expressions in your journal?
I'd love to. I've always focused more on vocabulary and grammar, but I see now that connectors are just as important for making my writing sound more natural and logical. I'll definitely experiment with that. Another thing I've been wondering about is when I'm speaking, I often have to pause to think of the right word. I've heard people say fillers like or you know. Are they bad to use, or should I try to avoid them?
The classic and you know. Fillers are actually quite common in natural speech, even among native speakers. They give you time to think or gather your thoughts without leaving a long silence. That said, it's important not to overuse them because they can make you sound less confident or prepared. Instead, you can try using short pauses and taking a breath when you need time to think. You can also practice by speaking on a topic for a minute or two without fillers, even if you have to pause and gather your thoughts. The more you practice speaking without fillers, the more natural it will become. Have you tried doing short impromptu talks on topics you enjoy?
I haven't tried that, but it sounds like a great way to practice. I'll start doing impromptu talks about things I'm interested in, like sports or movies, and try to avoid using fillers. It might feel awkward at first, but I guess that's part of the learning process, right? One last thing, sometimes when I'm listening to English speakers, they talk so fast. How do I improve my listening skills to keep up with fast speakers?
Fast speaking is definitely challenging. The best way to improve your listening skills is through practice and repetition. Start by listening to content at a slower pace. Many podcasts and videos allow you to adjust the speed. Once you're comfortable with a slower pace, gradually increase it. Another technique is to shadow native speakers. This means you listen to a short segment of speech and then immediately repeat it out loud, trying to match the speaker's speed, tone, and rhythm. This helps improve both listening and speaking skills. Additionally, try focusing on listening to different accents and speaking speeds. Over time, Your brain will adapt, and you'll be able to understand faster speech with more ease. Have you tried listening to a variety of speakers?
I haven't tried shadowing yet, but I can see how that would help with both understanding and speaking faster. I usually just focus on listening to one speaker at a time. I'll start mixing it up and challenging myself with different accents. Thanks so much for all this advice, teacher. I feel like I have so many practical tools now to improve my English.
You're welcome, Simon. I'm glad to see you so motivated. Remember, language learning is a marathon, not a sprint. Don't worry if things feel slow at times. Just keep going, and you'll see progress. The most important thing is to stay consistent, stay curious, and most importantly, enjoy the process. You've got this.
This dialogue highlights the process of transitioning from translation-based thinking to more intuitive English use. By focusing on immersion, practicing speaking, and expanding vocabulary, Simon gains valuable tools to improve fluency and confidence. The conversation underscores that consistent practice, embracing mistakes, and staying curious are key to mastering English.
Thanks for watching. Remember to subscribe, like, comment, and share to keep the English learning journey alive.